Yeah, we always start at least 5 minutes late at UW.
We're gonna give it one more minute.
Okay.
And that thing fixed to, I think we'll just get going. So good afternoon, Bobby Schnabel from Computer Science, and it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Yoshi Kohno. So if you've looked at his homepage, and I encourage you to do that, if I went through all of Yoshi's career and accomplishments, he wouldn't have any time left to talk. So we're not going to do that. I'm just going to hit a very few highlights. So Yoshi is a full professor in the computer science department at the University of Washington, which, if you don't know, is one of the top handful of computer science departments in the nation. He also holds appointments in electrical engineering, the School of Information, and the law school, which gives you some insight into his breadth. And on top of that, he's currently the Associate Dean for Faculty Success for the whole engineering college. Yoshi has received many awards during his career already. Just a few of those are an NSF Career Award, which is the big Young Faculty Award, a bunch of Test of Time awards for papers, and those are kind of as good as it gets because that's research that you've done that's been shown to have a big impact over a period of time, and just last year was named IEEE Fellow. His research is very impactful, very varied, and creative in the areas of security and privacy, and with a lot of the societal implications attached to that as well. But none of that is the most important for an introduction here. The most important thing for an introduction here is that Yoshi is one of our alums. He got his undergraduate degree in computer science from here, working with Hal Gabbo, who we just saw earlier today, and with Evie Nemeth, who unfortunately is no longer with us. So as you can see, his talk is going to be on ethical frameworks in computer security trolley problems, foundations for conversations.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. It is definitely truly a pleasure to be here and to see all of you. And quite an interesting mind switch for me, because I remember sitting in, I believe, the back, from my angle, back left of this room for Evie Nemeth's introduction C and Unix workshop many years ago. It did advance before. First of all, I want to thank all of you. I know all your days are very busy, so thank you for joining for this talk. I hope you come away with something interesting at least. And thank you to CU. As this site says, CU has always been my home. I got my bachelor's here in 1999 and come back as often as I can. And truly, I really believe that my undergraduate education is what set me on the path that I have then pursued. And so as Bobby mentioned, I mean, I owe so much gratitude to all my CU instructors. Clayton Lewis was my CSE 1300 instructor and has followed me throughout my career. But my two undergrad advisors, Hal Gabbo, from whom I learned lots of how to think precisely and mathematically, and Evie Nemeth, rest in peace, from whom I learned a lot about security and systems and networking. And both of them and CU has set me on the path for where I am today. So again, I would not be here without the advice, mentorship, and education that I received at CU. So I am very grateful to be here and for everyone that has been part of my journey. So this talk is about ethics and computer security. And so as to jump in, I want to give a little bit about my perspective on that. First, ethical considerations are fundamentally important throughout all of computer science and beyond. And if you haven't, many of you have probably already been thinking about ethics. I know there's ethics courses here already, but I encourage you to explore it on your own as well. For myself, even though I had realized that ethics is important, I did not have a structured method through reasoning through ethical considerations. In many cases, this might have been fine, but I observed a number of situations where there were disagreements within our community where two or more people that I deeply respected had different ideas of what constituted the ethically right and morally correct decision. And so I was on a quest to try to help better understand how to reason through challenging ethical questions. Over time, I have learned a lot about ethics and moral philosophy. Here, I should also credit with deep gratitude my collaborators, Wolf Lowe, who's a moral philosophy professor, and Yasemin Ajar, two co-authors on the work that I'll be talking about. And learning about ethics and moral philosophy has helped me both better understand my own ethical thinking and have conversations with people who have opinions different than my own. So a brief summary of this talk, it captures some of what I've learned with specific applications to computer security scenarios. My hope is that what I talk about today will be broadly applicable to other subfields of computer science, even if you're not working in security. In many senses, I need to acknowledge that this talk is not new. Ethics and moral philosophy is a field that has existed for centuries and more. But the application to computer security is something I want to focus on. This talk is also incomplete. As a discipline that has existed for centuries, this talk is only a glimpse into it. Also acknowledge that it's easy to misinterpret. I will present some scenarios in this talk, but want to acknowledge from the beginning that real-world scenarios are even more complicated, significantly, than the ones I will describe. But still, I hope that this introduction will be valuable to those who encounter ethical questions themselves. So with that, let me jump into a bit of background. As I said, ethics and moral philosophy is a field that has existed for centuries. If you're not in the computer security field, or unfamiliar with it, I would define computer security as computing in the presence of adversaries. Within our field and as a research field and in industry and in much of computer science and science in general, ethics and moral questions can arise in multiple spots. So for example, deciding whether or not to pursue a project, deciding on the path for the project. In computer security, we oftentimes discover vulnerabilities, and there are ethical questions about when and where and how to disclose those vulnerabilities to the impacted stakeholders and to the public. Industry might want to or face the question of how much money and time should they invest in addressing a discovered security vulnerability and more. Our field, my field, computer security, already cares deeply about ethics and morality. We see this because program committee members have established ethics review subcommittees tasked specifically to evaluate the ethics of submissions. Conference call for papers in our community, in our subfield, as well as some other computer science subfields, also explicitly discuss ethics. In our field, we see authors discussing ethics in their submissions. We also see, a number of other things happening, such as the Menlo report, which is a report about how to do ethical computer security research. The National Science Foundation had discussions on ethics. We have the reviewer ethics committees and so on. So our community does care a lot about ethics and moral, being ethical and being morally correct. But in general, our discussions are not deeply connected with the frameworks, tools, and the history and the foundations of ethics and moral philosophy. I want to acknowledge that in many cases, this lack of a deep connection is fine because our community is still making good decisions. But the question is, can we as a community grow by exploring that connection even more? So from repeating that last slide, I do believe that our field is often making good decisions, but sometimes maybe it is not. One of the questions that we might encounter is, well, how do we actually define what constitutes a good decision? And what do we do when different people have different definitions of good? And so this is the question that we are exploring in our research. Our short-term goal was to facilitate open, transparent, and clear communications when there are disagreements about what might constitute the morally correct action. Our non-goal is to present an approach for determining what to do when faced with a moral dilemma, but really how to have these open conversations. And the method that we will use, which I'm going to go into momentarily, is we explore ethics-related computer security scenarios from the perspective of existing ethical frameworks. And in doing so, I'm hoping that we can also cultivate some common language for discussing ethics-related concerns. And a long-term goal is to contribute to the computer security community's growing understanding of how to conduct ethical research and how to evaluate the ethics of the research that has been done. Okay, so with that, let me jump into the next portion of the talk, which is the computer security trolley problems. Some of you might have encountered trolley problems already, some of you might have not, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, kind of as a ethics and moral philosophy 101, I'm going to briefly present this classical ethical dilemma or thought experiment known as the trolley problem. So in this scenario, we have a trolley running straight along a set of tracks, and the trolley has no brakes. Along the tracks that the trolley is tied to, five people are tied to those tracks. On an alternate set of tracks, one person is tied to an alternate set of tracks. A trolley operator, denoted kind of by the question mark in the middle, observes this situation, and the trolley operator is given a choice. The trolley operator can, remember, the trolley has no brakes. The trolley operator can choose to do nothing, in which case 5 people would die. Or the trolley operator can intervene in the situation, push the lever, cause the trolley to go on an alternate set of tracks, in which case 1 person would die. And so the question that moral philosophers have asked is, what should the trolley operator do? And that's a question that you might think of for yourself. If you find that this talk gets a little bit too boring or whatever, or even afterwards, I encourage you to explore these trolley problems in more depth by going to this webpage. You can either scan the QR code, and this QR code actually takes you to this webpage. We have talked with someone else earlier about how this could be a Rickroll, but it's not. Or you can go to neil.fun absurd trolley problems and kind of explore some of these other scenarios where you're presented with a situation and what would you do in an ethically challenging situation where neither of the two options is universally good. But given the role of the trolley problems in ethics and moral philosophy as a tool or instrument to discussing different approaches to morality, we wanted to build on these trolley problems and explicitly explore computer security themed trolley problems. And so working with an ethics and moral philosopher and our team, spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, what were the right criteria for these trolley problems? More details are in our paper. But one of the things that you'll see is that unlike the real world, where people are presented with many options, in our trolley problems, just like the one you were shown, they are presented with a binary option. You have to choose between 1 or 2 options, neither of which are universally desirable. They are dilemmas, which is what I just said, which is like the trolley problem. Our scenarios are proposed moral dilemmas where neither one of the solutions is entirely ethically satisfactory. I will note that the descriptions of these scenarios have lots of details, and the details were designed to reduce the ambiguity. So I will read, and please do read all the details, and noting that the real world has many, many more uncertainties. And the details do matter. For example, sometimes changing any of these little details can change our analyses or make our analyses more complicated. So with that, let me introduce you to our first scenario. This is about medical device vulnerabilities. As you'll note underneath the title, I put in parentheses that some details may not match reality. So the point with these scenarios is to envision this world that I describe and try to use as an exercise to think about what would be the morally correct answer in this scenario. So scenario A. Imagine that you're a researcher in the following scenario. You are studying the computer security properties of a wireless implantable medical device, a device that is known to extend the lives of patients by at least 10 years. You find a vulnerability that, if exploited, could cause significant harm. And the question is, what would you do? And this is not actually a hypothetical question because I will ask you to discuss amongst yourselves momentarily. But let me expand on this situation. The company that made the medical device no longer exists. It went bankrupt. And so now it is actually impossible to patch the vulnerability. Also imagine that many patients already have the device in their bodies, and the device is still being implanted in new patients. Again, or may not match reality. I don't know what the FDA would do in this for this particular company that's expired, but in our scenario, imagine that many patients still have the devices in their body, and the device is still being implanted in new patients. And because the company does not exist, in our scenario, you must choose between either disclosing the vulnerability to everyone, medical practitioners, the public, including patients, or no one at all. And imagine that for the purposes of this analysis, imagine that the likelihood of an adversary exploiting the vulnerability is extremely low. For our purposes, we can just assume 0 for ease of analysis, regardless of whether or how you disclose the vulnerability. This means that if you do disclose the vulnerability to everyone, there's still the likelihood of an adversary using that knowledge is small, close to 0, or it can assume 0. Or if you do not disclose the vulnerability, we should assume that no one discovers it and then uses it in an exploit. So the question is, what do you do in this situation? Just like the trolley problem before, we have 2 options. One option is do nothing, do not disclose. In this situation, the patients have no awareness that their device is vulnerable. And as a consequence, patients can keep the devices they already have or proceed with obtaining a new implantation and receive significant health benefits. Or you can decide to disclose the vulnerability to everyone. And now patients have a choice of whether or not to receive the device or to have the device removed. But there is a risk of psychological harm if patients know they have an imperfect device or a device with a vulnerability, even if the chance of exploitation is 0 or close to 0. And let's assume that the risk of health harms to and in this situation, there is a risk of a health harm to patients if they do not receive the device or remove the device. Yes, your question?
One is what is the level of security regarding the patient identity? So if it's an exploitable device, but nobody knows who has the device, then that's the risk that it's somehow a visible device and it'd be vulnerable to anybody who might.
It's a good question. So the question for people on Zoom was, how identifiable is it whether someone has the device or not? This is not something we actually built into the scenario because this kind of goes into threat modeling and risk analysis and the likelihood of identification. And for our purposes, for our analysis, we just wanted to make the likelihood of an exploit 0 or very close to 0 regardless. And so for our purposes, let's assume that even if it's identifiable or not, the likelihood is small, but it's a very good question. So what would you do in this situation? Both options have undesirable aspects. And we have found that different people, for very good reasons, will make different decisions for this particular scenario. Stepping back, when faced with a challenging ethical decision, I find it very helpful to talk with other people and hear other perspectives. And so that is what we are going to do in a moment. So the task for 60 to 90 seconds is to find someone near you and share your thoughts on what decision you think the researchers should make, or how they should go about making this decision. Remember, you're not expected to have a singular right answer, and in fact, remember that different people will have different answers for very good reasons. Also, no expectation that anyone in this room is already an expert on ethics already. But even then, if you feel like you don't want to actually say, this is what I would do, you are welcome to take the path of saying, I think someone might make decision X not to disclose, for example, for these reasons, without actually saying that that's necessarily what you think at this time. So for 60 or 90 seconds, please do that. And in the meantime, I will leave this slide up, which presents the 2 options, either not disclose or disclose.
I have a quick question, a clarifying question, if I may.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, 30 more seconds or so. Okay, let's go ahead and return. I don't expect anyone to have fully solved the situation at this time, so I imagine that some conversations could continue. But let's go ahead and return to kind of overviewing of different ethical frameworks and these trolley problems. But first I'm going to ask is, raise your hand if your group was not in perfect agreement or did not initially agree. So a number of hands went up. Yes, thank you very much. And so this is why we embarked on this research, because there oftentimes can be different, both paths can be right from different perspectives. So in some cases, there's not consensus on what is morally right or acceptable. And in such situations, having tools to reason through the ethical decisions can help. Okay, here is our scenario B. Again, there is a lot of words on this slide. The details are here because they matter. I'm going to go ahead and read through the details and then kind of add a little bit more as we get through it. So this is scenario B. Company B matches employers, that is jobs, with job applicants. The company is growing rapidly and will have 100 times more job applicants in 5 years. Job applicant packets are confidential, as are some job-specific questions. Company B's AI Company B's has an AI application. The Company B's AI job to applicant matching system is suspected to have racial and gender biases. Company B is compromised, and the entirety of their data, all past jobs, all past application packets, their internal ML models, everything is stolen. Stolen and put on the internet. Researchers wish to study the stolen data to scientifically measure the racial and gender biases, and if biases are found, to measure the impacts of those biases on past job applicants. The researchers also wish to study the data and assess whether the AI system is vulnerable to adversarial manipulations, which means, which could negatively impact future job applicants. The question at the bottom is, what should the researchers study this data? The researchers plan to propose technical and policy mechanisms to mitigate any issues, for example, biases or vulnerabilities that they uncover. And removing these biases means that more people will be connected with jobs. Parenthetical, for our analysis, we assume that removing these biases does not make it harder for other people to get jobs. And remember, this company is growing 100 times over the next 5 years. That said, many job applicants have publicly stated a desire that their stolen data be erased permanently from everywhere that it's been stored. The researchers obtained a copy of the data while it was still publicly available and before the job applicants stated that desire. And if the researchers study the data, they must retain a copy to use in results validation in case the results are challenged, for example, challenged by Company B. Should the researchers study this data? There's a question?
Yeah. Would the data eventually become private?
So in this scenario, what happened is that the attackers broke into the system, stole everything, put it all on the internet. The researchers obtained a copy very early on because they were monitoring this. Then once this hit the news, the the job applicant said, wait, this is our private data, please take it down. And it was taken down from all the public repositories. But the researchers now still have their private copy and are trying to figure out what to do. So if the data is not studied, the stolen data is from people. In choosing this option, the researchers would not have further violated their privacy and their right to informed consent. If they study the data, the results will help prevent future job applicants from being harmed by a biased or vulnerable job to applicant AI matching system. What should the researchers do in this situation? Yeah.
Just ask if you happen to know what would be like the legal free.
So the question is, what is the law? What is the legal situation in this case? So the law and ethics are different. For this particular scenario, for our conversation, let's make it entirely about ethics. The legal aspects, I'm not sure. Yeah, it might depend on the specific situation. It's a good question. Let me give you another scenario. Inadvertent data disclosure. So imagine that you're on a program committee. You're a program committee member in the following scenario. A research paper is submitted to a conference that you're on the program committee for. And the paper details the discovery of an undisclosed vulnerability in the product of company C. The authors write in their paper that they will eventually disclose the vulnerability to company C so that they can start fixing it. The authors do not want to disclose to company C until after the paper has been officially accepted. They don't say why, but they just say our plan is if after accepted, we will disclose to company C. You are on the program committee and you read this paper. What do? You're also an employee of company C. You read the paper and you realize that the vulnerability can lead to a serious harm, can lead to serious harms if exploited. And it will take your company a long time to patch the vulnerability. And you're worried that adversaries might independently discover and start using the vulnerability before the paper is accepted and company C is notified. For our purposes, assume that the program chairs also required all committee members to explicitly agree to maintain the confidentiality of submissions. And you verified with your employer that you could agree to these terms before joining the program committee. And you promised to maintain that confidentiality. You could choose not to report the vulnerability internally to your company. Here, the confidentiality of the PC process is preserved. And now the authors have agency over when and how they disclose the vulnerability. Or you can choose to report the vulnerability to your company. Your company can now check to see if the vulnerability is already being exploited. And you can immediately begin working on solutions to protect your users. And your users' privacy, security, and safety will be protected before the vulnerability becomes public. What would you do in this scenario? For the interest of time, I decided let's not jump into conversations about this, though. Please feel free to talk with your colleagues and neighbors afterwards of what you think you might do in these situations. This was to leave up if we jumped into those scenarios. But again, scenario 1 is on vulnerable medical devices. Scenario 2 is on should you study stolen data or researchers study stolen data. And scenario C is what do you do if you're a program committee member and you encounter a paper that has a vulnerability in the company, in the product of the company that you work for. So with that, let me now take a detour through what I'm calling Consequentialist and Deontological Ethics 101. So ethics and morality. Again, I've learned a lot from my collaborator, Wolf Lowe, who's a professor of ethics and moral philosophy. Ethics is the academic and professional engagement with moral questions. And morality is the scope of that engagement. It's the sum of all moral considerations. It is, what we owe each other. It is, is this situation moral or not? So what we use ethics to determine if something, for example, an action or a policy is moral. Modern ethicists do use the term ethics and morality interchangeably. And so the security community, including myself, oftentimes use the words ethics and morality interchangeably. And so the security field is not wrong to use ethics to encompass both ethics and morality. But ethics and moral philosophers might sometimes have a slight bit of a distinction. Consequentialist and deontological ethics are two of today's leading ethical frameworks. And there are strong echoes of consequentialism and deontological ethics throughout the computer security research field already, way before we embarked on our research. For example, there's the classic Menlo report, which in the security field builds on the Belmont report, which some of you might also know about, as well as this one. And they have various principles such as respect for persons that reflect deontological ethics, or beneficence, which reflects consequentialist ethics. Conference call for papers in the security field at least have echoes of consequentialism and deontological ethics sections, and papers also have echoes of this, even if they do not say so explicitly. And because of these strong echoes of consequentialism and deontological ethics, these slides in the current work focus on these two ethical frameworks. But I think it's important to note that these frameworks have limitations. For example, they center Western approaches to ethics, even if they include elements of non-Western approaches. And I want to be explicit that we are not arguing for a strict adherence to either of these frameworks. And in fact, it's not uncommon for people, including ethicists, to include elements of multiple frameworks in our analyses. And also, of course, encourage people who are interested in this topic to read beyond, study beyond just these two frameworks here. But the reason that one of the values that I, at least for myself, have found by explicitly considering and articulating both consequentialist and deontological ethics is that by understanding both consequentialist and deontological ethics, it helps me better understand when people's opinions on what is ethically or morally correct might diverge and where they might have similarities. And so referencing them can help in the decision-making process. It can help decision makers as you reason through moral questions, or also untangle situations when two or more decision makers might disagree. So here is the trolley problem that I presented before. As a brief reminder, a trolley with no brakes is heading straight along a set of tracks. 5 people are tied to the track. The trolley operator observes this and can do nothing, resulting in the death of 5 people, or change the trolley track, resulting in the death of 1 person. If we take a consequentialist ethics perspective, consequentialism focuses on the consequences of whatever's under consideration, the action or the policy and so on. A well-known example of consequentialism is utilitarianism, where the consequences are measured with respect to some definition of well-being. If you dive deeper, there are actually multiple definitions of utilitarianism. One is hedonic utilitarianism, where the consequences are measured with respect to happiness. So actions are morally right if they promote the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. Another example is objective list utilitarianism, where actions are morally right if they promote the greatest benefits from a specific list to the greatest number of people. So we could say, promote the greatest health or the greatest wealth or the greatest access to resources. One key note is that consequentialists count numbers and they weigh the benefits versus the harms. And so in the trolley problem, 5 deaths are measurably worse than 1 death. And so the consequentialist choice would be to change the trolley tracks. Deontological ethics focuses on the duties of the moral actor, which might be an individual or an institution. In deontological ethics, we believe that people have fundamental rights, and moral actors have the duty to respect those rights. For example, there's the right to privacy, or the right to self-agency, or the right to informed consent. One very well-known example of deontological ethics is Kantian deontological ethics, which says that one should not violate any single person's right in order to accomplish another objective. You might have heard Kant describes this as the categorical imperative, which means that humans should be treated as ends and never purely as means. And I'll give a little more example of what I mean by that. But again, one should not violate a single person's right in order to accomplish another objective. So changing the trolley tracks would violate one person's right, the right to live, in order to accomplish the saving of 5 other lives. So changing the track would use that single person as a means, not as an end, a means towards saving those 5 other lives. And so under Kantian deontological ethics, you do not change the trolley tracks. And again, noting that these frameworks have limitations, modern ethicists do not use a single framework. Again, consequentialism and deontological both have limitations. And as a result, they've evolved significantly over time. And so I'm presenting a very simplistic view of them, but a view that I think still enables informed conversations about how different perspectives might apply to certain scenarios. And again, our goal is not to encourage adoption of either of these, but to rather explore how different ethical frameworks can come to different conclusions of what is good or morally right. So now let's return to the trolley problems the security themed trolley problems that I mentioned earlier. This is the medical device scenario where researchers find a vulnerability in a medical device and are trying to decide whether to disclose to everyone or no one at all for the manufacturer, because the manufacturer is out of business. If we take a consequentialist perspective, we note that the likelihood of an exploitation is near zero. We note that there are, however, harms if patients are informed. There's a health harm if they remove the device or they choose not to get the device. There's also a happiness harm if they have to live with the knowledge that their device has faults. And so weighing the benefits versus the harms, the morally correct action under the consequentialist analysis is to not disclose the vulnerability. Taking a deontological perspective, we note that there is the duty to respect people's rights. There's a duty to respect people's rights to informed consent. Consider, for example, how often you see or hear warnings with respect to medicine ads. And people also have a right to self-agency, to make a decision about how to govern themselves and their own bodies. And so from a deontological perspective, the morally correct answer is to disclose the vulnerability to everyone. Okay, so the next scenario, scenario B, where adversaries have stolen data, and now the researchers obtained a copy. The people in the data set say, please, this data is private, and the researchers are trying to decide whether to study that data. From a consequentialist perspective, again, we weigh benefits versus harms. There's benefits in studying the data to society and to future job applicants, and this benefit is high. Recall that there's going to be 10 times more job applicants over the next 5 years. 100 times, sorry. The data was already made public, which itself caused harms, but the study of the data does not create any new harms. Therefore, under this consequentialist analysis, the morally correct decision is to study the data. Taking a deontological perspective, people have a right to privacy and informed consent. The rights extend to data intended to be private, even if the researchers have access. And in the impacted job applicants explicitly requested that the data be deleted. And so although studying the data can improve the rights of future applicants, doing so would be at the expense of the rights of those impacted by the data breach. Recall what I said earlier on Kantian deontological ethics, people should only be treated as ends and never as means. So the morally correct action is to not study the data. You're on the program committee and you encounter a paper that has an undisclosed vulnerability in your company's project. What do you do? That's scenario C. From a consequentialist perspective, we say that we acknowledge that there are possible harms to authors if the employee of company C discloses their vulnerability to that company. The authors had some reason they didn't want to, so there might be some harm to the authors if this vulnerability is disclosed before they've given the chance to do so themselves. But there's also significant benefit to company C's users if the employee discloses their vulnerability to company C. And so we need to weigh the benefits and the harms. And the way the scenario was set up, the consequentialist analysis says that the employee of company C should report the vulnerability to their company. From a deontological perspective, the program committee may feel a sense of duty to company C and their users. The program committee members also have a duty to respect the autonomy of authors and the confidentiality of the peer review process. The employee agreed to respect this duty when they joined the program committee, as did the leadership team. And we also note that if breaking the confidentiality of the peer review process is allowed, then the whole institution of the peer review process may not be possible. So under a deontological analysis, we would conclude that company C employees should not report the vulnerability to company C. So let's reflect on these a little bit and then have time for some discussion. Is my belief, having worked on this for a while, is that it can be informative to explicitly articulate the underlying ethical framework when evaluating the morality of an action. And when taking the perspective from one framework, we may arrive at a different conclusion than when taking a different perspective, and that's important to note. But note also that we may arrive at the same conclusion using different frameworks. But even when we arrive at the same conclusion using different frameworks, I believe that it can be valuable to be able to articulate the reasoning under multiple frameworks that got to that same conclusion. One suggestion I have is that when disagreements arise, step back and consider what the different stakeholders are centering or valuing. For example, are they valuing rights and responsibilities, in which case they might be taking a deontological perspective? Are they valuing and talking about the benefits and the harms of the decision, in which case they might be talking about consequentialist ethics? If you read our paper, we talk about a number of other scenarios, some of which talk about like, well, the intent of the actor and were they behaving virtuously, even if a bad action resulted, which is related to virtue ethics. A number of other ethical frameworks are out there, which I encourage you to, or I can talk about more if you're interested as well. Discourse ethics, which is, was there a discussion that led to a conclusion, an idealized discussion, emancipatory ethics, and pragmatism. And so pragmatism is the question of whether someone says, well, this is what we did it in the past, but we need to apply the same rule this time. A moral pragmatist might say, no, we need to look at the specific situation here, and it might be different than the past, and reason through this new situation anew. And also important to ask, are there other options that we have not yet considered? So for example, in the scenarios I presented, I gave you only a binary option and said you had to choose between one or two paths. But there are oftentimes in the real world, there are other options available. So for example, for scenario C, the program committee member might begin by talking with the program chair, for example. In the case of program scenario B with the data, researchers might, for example, consider talking with advocacy groups or people who could speak on behalf of those impacted by the data breach, for example. So there are often other paths to pursue. Example decision-making process. Step 0, identify all the stakeholders that might be impacted by the different decisions, and also try to explore what the different decisions might be. So again, not just disclose or not disclose, but talk to the program chair. What are all the options? Step 1, then after that, is apply known methods for ethical evaluations. So within the security community, we might apply the Menlo report. You might apply consequentialist and deontological ethics. When what constitutes what is good or morally right is not obvious, then I encourage you to clearly and precisely and thoughtfully explore and articulate arguments both for and against the different decisions. And then again, being thoughtful that there exist different approaches that sometimes come to different conclusions. So this paper and a similar slide deck is online, Security Ethics, CS.Washington.edu. Happy to answer questions, or amongst yourselves as you leave the room, you might consider thinking about what ethical scenarios have you encountered or have you heard about? For your scenarios, is there an obvious right answer, or might different people come to different conclusions? And do you have hard ethical questions or decisions that you want to share? So with that, I'll conclude and happy to answer questions or facilitate a discussion.
Thanks, sir. So I know you are focusing on computer security, but I wonder if you've considered how your work might influence the development of algorithms that have to make ethical decisions. So, for example, if the operator of the trolley is a programmer.
It's an excellent question. The question was, have I considered how this work might influence how algorithms might make decisions? Here I would say I'm not nearly an expert. So I can tell you what I think, but I'm sure there's a lot of great works that are happening that I'm unaware of. One of the things that strikes me is that even when we raised the hand earlier for scenario A, different people had different opinions on what is right. And so one of the questions that I have for any sort of algorithmic decision-making process is which framework, which approach is codified into that system, and who is included in that and who is excluded in that. So if that makes sense. And one of again, this is me personally speaking without, being an expert on, AI ethics so much, is, in a human world, we have many, many people, and the decision-making processes are such that, different people with different ethical decisions will discuss important scenarios and finally make a decision together, for example. But if we have a single algorithm that is just universally deployed and embodies just one particular framework or perspective, that's a big challenge. So I don't know necessarily how to overcome that challenge, so I guess my work helps me think about it as being a challenge, but not as a solution, if I answered the question. Yes.
I've seen sections in papers where they've essentially had to say, oh, do you have any ethical concerns as like required for certain drug solutions at that point? And I've also seen papers that literally state, we have no ethical concerns with this work in here. Do you see any effective ways to hold people's feet to the fire a little bit to force them to actually engage with ethical ramifications of their work as they're submitting it?
It is a great question. So the question is, having observed that sometimes papers might say in their ethical considerations, we have no ethical considerations, period, and without actually engaging in the topic. And how can we get people more engaged with proactive ethical considerations early? And I'm saying this for the Zoom audience. I don't know how big it is. It is a great question. There's at least two different approaches for this. One is, my hope is that we kind of increase overall in the community the practice of thoughtful ethical considerations such that it becomes more and more the norm and more kind of expected, and just kind of everyone does it because everyone is already doing it. I don't necessarily recommend that in all aspects of life, but for ethical considerations, I would. The other thing that we are doing, at least for Usenix security, which I'm involved with, of course, there are other security conferences, is for Usenix security 2025, all authors are required to submit an ethical considerations section for all papers. And the program chairs and the program committee is evaluating it to look at whether that is substantive. And a question of like, there are no ethical concerns, I think by and large is getting feedback. Look, you need to actually articulate not that you don't think they're ethical concerns, but what analysis you made such that you then got to the conclusion that there was no ethical concerns. The reason articulated for this, that the program committee is articulating for this, is that as a matter of science, that is part of our methodology of kind of going through what we are doing to derive there are no ethical concerns. And so future researchers can learn from that thought process. They might agree, they might disagree, but they can learn from it. And second, it provides an opportunity to just kind of be reflective. And again, we know that different people might have different decisions, ultimately make different decisions, but it's important to have that understanding of how they approach the question, if that answers your question.
Just play like devil's advocate. It's not super clear to me that the onus for assessing the ethical considerations of some empirical work or some theoretical, they went through this procedure and reached this conclusion. That seems kind of orthogonal to estimating its like impact at scale, right? And it could be that like the person who did a certain kind of work is very much the wrong person for the job to say whether it's ethical or not. And by including that in the paper, you might be including sort of a misguidance. When somebody goes and reads it and say, oh, well, this person wrote the paper, they're going to be the closest thing to authority on the ethics with respect to this. But it could be actually rather someone like you, an independent source, would be better suited to like carefully assess ethical impacts at large.
So if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, the question centers around, are the researchers involved in the research the right people to make the ethical decision about the research, or would it be better to have an external entity? If you read our paper, we have some one of the things to think about is that the researchers may have a vested interest in the output, one of the things I did not say on the slide, but I will say now is the correct approach to ethics is to not figure out the outcome you want and then figure out, okay, well, which ethical framework supports this outcome, which is possible under these scenarios. So long story short is, yes, I believe that having external perspectives on ethics is incredibly valuable before the research begins, as opposed to wait, now we wait afterwards when some harms might have happened. I don't know how to get there, but I know kind of a next step, and that next step is having the authors more proactively engage with it. But there are the limitations, as you point out. Yep. Oh, sorry.
What do you think about the current state of like ethics review, right? Like on the other side now, authors, and I think in a lot of works, it's easy for all authors to sort of be ethically aligned, right? They kind of came together to work on the same way. But when an ethic review committee is looking at something and they're coming from a different perspective, especially when you have different frameworks, how can they, I guess, an appropriate outcome?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was centered around on the ethics review committee side. I'm not sure exactly how the right way to articulate it, but noting that there are different approaches on what is ethical, even if the authors all agreed with it and had the best interest at heart, came to a conclusion of this is ethical, there can be a situation where the program committee disagrees and they come from a different perspective. And what to do in that situation. That is very difficult. And so one of the things that I would say is first, the ethics review committees should ideally be aware of the fact that there is a difference between what I think is right and whether the authors went through a process to determine, a reasonable, well-motivated process to determine what is right. So that's one thing to think about. But you're actually hitting on a research question that I'm very, very interested in, which is better understanding the community's perspective on ethics and morality. For example, I have learned through my collaborators, both Wolf and Yasmin are in Germany, that Germany and other parts of Europe have kind of a generally different approach to ethics than the United States. My understanding is correct. German much more deontological, United States much more consequentialist by and large. And so what can happen is if you have, papers written by, a German research team being evaluated by a US team, might give a different perspective on ethics than a German paper being evaluated by German authors. And so trying to understand just a big global diversity on ethics, and then how do we reason through that being a global community is something I'm interested in, but I don't have full answers. I'm not sure what time we have, but I know you had a question. Yeah. Oh, okay, sure.
Have they studied security ethics of autonomous, defensive, or offensive code systems of the future?
Okay, and I guess you read that a lot, so people saw that on Zoom. Short answer is I'm sure people have, but I'm not one of them, and I don't know the right citations for that. But there certainly have been a lot of ethical analysis, not necessarily within the security community, on autonomous weapon systems. So, military ethics or whatnot. Again, outside of what I've looked at, but I would not be surprised if there's something in that orbit with respect to what you just described. Yeah, thank you.
Many a lot of conversations over time. I'm wondering if you've noticed any shift in how willing people are to talk to each other from different points of view, because there's a lot of data coming out that people are very politically polarized, and I'm wondering if that translates into ethically polarized and having difficulties bridging the gap and having healthy conversations.
It's a good question. The question was, have I noticed a shift in time about people's willingness to kind of engage kind of collaboratively on these difficult questions when there might be disagreement? It's hard for me to say, in part because there's been another variable, which has just been the significant increase in the size of our community over time. And so as a consequence of the size of the community, I would say that my particular window into the community has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller proportionally to the global size of the community. Within many spaces that I operate, I feel like people are very proactively engaged in ethics and eager to discuss the challenges and are aware of it being a challenge. But the reason I talked about the community growing and my window being small is that I cannot say for certain that is not a function of the fact that I'm already in an orbit of people who are engaged with ethics. So that's a good question.
So kind of to go off with the algorithm question,
with a lot of the AI systems being trained on like historical data rather than current data streams coming in, how might you categorize the ethical framework of just using historical examples to make a decision instead of actively thinking through something and just going, well, this is what's been done, so this is what we're going to continue to do?
Ah, interesting. Well, AI systems are so diverse. So the question was, something about, AI systems been based a lot on historical data and the question about like the ethics and morality of making decisions into the future uh, based off of, just what was in the past. Without, of course, AI systems are so large that I can't say that I fully can represent all of them, but it does connect to me to the principle of moral pragmatism. Again, I'm not an ethics and moral philosopher, but I'll try to articulate my understanding of ethics and moral pragmatism, which is that times change. We learn more as a society over time. We learn more as a community over time. Sometimes someone might made a decision that at that time we thought was a good decision, and then we saw the outcome of that, and that informs our ability to then how do we treat that similar situation next time. And so moral pragmatism says that the same situation when encountered again should not necessarily receive the same decision, but should instead be evaluated for that case at that time. And so the moral pragmatist perspective, which I would take in this situation, is that there is a risk of embedding decisions 10 years into the future based only on our knowledge of the world, in the past. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll ask you one, since there are no more hands, we can wrap with this one.
Yep.
As I've looked around the nation at courses on ethics and computing, they generally draw on the two frameworks that you use, the ontology and call it utilitarianism, and also virtue ethics. I think that's true in UW course as well. Is there a reason you concentrated on two of those and not the third?
It's a good question. So the question was, why did we concentrate on consequentialist and virtue ethics, consequentialism and deontological ethics, and not include virtue ethics? Sorry. The answer was, for me at least, it's a little bit hard to articulate an understanding of. So what is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics, and maybe please correct me if my summary is if you feel my summary is incorrect, but virtue ethics asks, was the person making the moral decision acting virtuously? This is something that is very hard if I'm like a program committee member to understand from a written paper. And so I wanted to focus on things that I could evaluate and make an argument for. And I could see it being a significant virtue ethics plays a role. And I can give you some examples of a scenario. I'll give you briefly some scenarios that we talk about in the paper. But it can be very hard to, write in a program committee review, we rejected this paper because of, we weren't acting virtuously. So at the ontological and consequentialist, we can kind of, I can reason through better. But virtue ethics is still very important. So I'll review briefly the scenario one of the scenarios we have in our paper, not that I did not describe here, which is you're on a program committee, you encounter a paper, section 7.3 of that paper describes something that should not have been done. For example, I think in our paper, they describe the crawl of the internet that looked for a certain thing, and the method of doing that certain thing could have crashed computers, including insulin pumps. So there's, the researchers should not have done this. In some variants of these scenarios, the researchers did extensive testing and really, really thought that there was no way to crash these systems, and they had it in a reporting system, ... Another group did the exact same experiment, exact same written paper, but the program chairs reached out for more information, and they just said, yeah, we didn't care. That's an example of where there might be an embedding of virtue. And the question is, do community members value these situations differently? And are kind of in preliminary evaluations, yes, they do, but it was much harder to get to that than consequential and deontological.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me.